I, John Bunyan, walked through a weary dawn where shadows clung to the earth like unanswered prayers. Ahead of me stood a young man, burdened by pursuits that had drained his soul of rest. The morning wind carried a solemn whisper, the same whisper I once heard when the kingdom first confronted my wandering heart. He paused before a broken stone etched with faded markings, as if time itself had tried to erase a truth too heavy for careless eyes. Yet the moment he touched it, I felt that ancient weight return, the weight of a call that demands the whole life, not fragments of it. His breath trembled beneath an unseen conviction. The sorrow in his gaze revealed the collapse of every false priority. I watched him wrestle with the ruins of his desires, sensing that the kingdom was no longer a distant idea, but a voice pressing upon his soul. And in that sacred stillness, a single question rose like fire within him. As the young man stared at the stone, his lips quivered as though an unseen hand beckoned him. I, John Bunyan, felt the air tighten, as if heaven itself waited for his answer. At last he whispered a question that would alter the course of his soul. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope. I, John Bunyan, watched the young man remain before the broken stone as if the world itself held its breath. In his eyes I recognized the same unrest that once consumed me, that ache born of realizing every human pursuit ends in rubble unless the kingdom stands at the center. The morning light touched his face, revealing a soul on the verge of awakening. He inhaled deeply, feeling the unseen weight pressing upon a heart confronted by divine priority. The kingdom of God is not an idea to be admired, nor a concept to be debated. It is a government that demands surrender. His trembling hands revealed not earthly fear, but the holy dread of one who senses that God is calling for all, not part. Tears traced his cheeks as he surveyed the scattered fragments of his ambitions. When the kingdom draws near, what once seemed so great collapses into dust. I watched this sacred breaking unfold in him, the same breaking that once shattered my own illusions and allowed grace to rebuild what pride had ruined. His question about seeking the kingdom first was not a quest for information but a cry for deliverance. I stepped closer, sensing the Spirit stirring the air around us. Christ's words are never mere commands, they are mirrors, exposing the ruler of the heart. This young man stood between two kingdoms, and only one could remain. As he wrestled with himself, memories stirred within me of standing before the narrow gate. Every earthly obsession that once defined me lost its power when confronted by the blazing truth of the kingdom. I saw him facing the same eternal threshold, where a man must choose between the throne he built and the throne he must bow to. He confessed victories that left him empty, nights ruled by anxiety, and paths that promised freedom but tightened chains around his soul. I recognized the wounds of striving without surrender. The kingdom comes closest when we are stripped of illusions and left with nothing but our need. Empty hands can finally receive a king. Without noticing, he fell to his knees. In that involuntary act, I saw the beginning of true seeking. To seek first is not to exert effort, but to relinquish control. It is the soul's quiet surrender to a king who already knows what we need before we ask. His trembling breath marked the start of this holy exchange. When he lifted his head, there was fire in his gaze, not the restless fire of ambition, but the refining flame of willingness. He asked if seeking the kingdom meant abandoning everything. I felt the Spirit stir within me, reminding me that Christ never invited men to add the kingdom to their lives, but to lay down their lives for the kingdom. I told him what I learned through stumbles and prisons alike. Seeking the kingdom means letting God order everything. It is not neglecting responsibilities but surrendering them. It is allowing heaven's will to govern earthly choices. When eternity becomes the measure, decisions once clouded become clear. He moved as though entering a new world, each step carrying a dawning awareness that the future is no longer built on personal dreams but on God's shaping hand. Fear and awe danced together in his expression. The kingdom at first unsettles, then steadies. It disrupts before it restores. I laid a hand on his shoulder and felt the trembling of a man standing at the edge of transformation. I told him that seeking first is an exchange, our control for God's wisdom, our striving for his guidance. He wept, realizing he had been building storms instead of sheltering under the king. He turned his eyes inward, revisiting chapters of his life written in haste and pride. The kingdom illuminates what we tried to hide and heals what we feared to face. Honesty flooded his gaze, honesty that marks the beginning of renewal. He no longer looked like a man seeking answers, but one surrendering to truth. When I asked what he most feared losing, hesitation exposed what words concealed. Seeking the kingdom unveils hidden idols. He whispered that he feared releasing the dreams that shaped his identity. I nodded, remembering my own painful renunciations. Yet the kingdom never steals, it purifies. I told him that Christ frees us not from identity, but from captivity. The kingdom removes what enslaves and returns what strengthens. He realized that the self he protected was built on fragile foundations, while God offered a rock no storm could move. He rose slowly, steadier than before. He asked if God truly adds all things when the kingdom becomes first. I answered with certainty, born of experience. The king is no debtor. His additions are not rewards, but provisions placed exactly where surrender has made space. They arrive not by our pacing, but by his perfect timing. I explained that seeking first is not deprivation, but liberation. Everything outside the kingdom eventually turns to smoke. Everything within it becomes treasure. His eyes widened as the weight of this truth settled. He had chased shadows when a kingdom of light had been calling all along. His fears began to loosen. Perseverance, he asked. Could he sustain it? I told him no man sustains the kingdom by strength. Grace sustains the man. Seeking does not require flawless effort, only daily yielding. The kingdom is not upheld by performers, but received by pilgrims. At dawn's full rising, he looked once more at the broken stone. What began as confusion now stood as clarity. The kingdom was not a distant hope, but a present authority. He took a slow breath and stepped forward, not into certainty but into surrender. And in surrender the seeking had truly begun. If this story touched your heart, comment your favorite lesson below. As the last glow of afternoon faded behind the hills, I, John Bunyan, led the young man along a narrow path carved by countless weary feet. The air carried that quiet gravity I knew well, the weight that descends when a soul steps into the territory of true surrender. His footsteps faltered at times, revealing a heart still wrestling with what the kingdom truly demands. I sensed he still bore chains, not fashioned by iron, but by longing and fear. The kingdom requires more than stirred emotion. It requires relinquishment. When he asked if the journey would be easy, I told him the truth every pilgrim learns. The narrow way wounds before it heals, strips before it clothes, humbles before it crowns. His fingers curled as if gripping the edges of his old life. He feared that seeking first meant carrying a burden too heavy. I explained that the weight of the kingdom is never supported by human strength. It is carried by grace. Christ does not ask men to be strong, only willing. His silence afterward spoke of a soul learning dependence. He wondered aloud whether seeking the kingdom meant abandoning his dreams entirely. I told him the king does not destroy the dreams we place before him. He refines them. What survives his fire is what was always meant to shape us. The rest was only smoke we mistook for substance. This truth both frightened and steadied him. As we walked, I heard his breath tighten under the pressure of unseen fears. Anxiety clings to any heart that tries to control tomorrow. I reminded him that Christ invited us to seek the kingdom first, precisely to free us from the tyranny of worry. The kingdom is peace, a peace rooted not in circumstances, but in surrender. He asked how a man knows if he is truly seeking the kingdom before all else. I answered that a heart governed by Christ no longer asks, "What do I want?" but, "What does the king desire?" The kingdom becomes visible in the decisions made when no one is watching, when obedience weighs more than outcome. He described his former life, running, striving, scrambling for approval. I listened as he confessed victories that left him emptier than failures. I told him the kingdom replaces frantic pursuit with purposeful steps. It lifts the soul from restless ambition to grounded obedience. His eyes softened as he grasped this exchange. As the path steepened, he stumbled and nearly fell. I steadied him, seeing in that moment a mirror of his inner journey. The kingdom reveals our frailty not to shame us, but to teach trust. He breathed deeply, sensing that every stumble was an invitation to lean on a strength not his own. We reached a brook whispering through the stones. I urged him to kneel and wash his hands. The cold water spoke of clarity and cleansing. I told him that seeking the kingdom means allowing God to wash our motives, desires, and intentions day by day. He closed his eyes, letting the water remind him of the purity the king requires. Then he asked why so many claim to seek the kingdom, yet live bound in incessant anxiety. The question pierced the quiet. I answered that many want the benefits of the kingdom without the authority of the king. They desire addition without surrender, peace without obedience. But where Christ does not rule, chaos thrives. He admitted fearing the loss of relationships if he fully committed to the kingdom. I told him the kingdom reveals genuine companions and exposes those anchored in shallow waters. No one who walks toward Christ loses what is eternal. They only lay aside what once hindered their soul. His expression carried both ache and relief. When we stepped into a clearing painted by twilight, I asked what he hoped to find by seeking the kingdom first. He whispered, peace, direction, and meaning. I told him these are never isolated gifts, but the natural fruit of living under God's reign. The kingdom reorganizes a life from the inside out. He began to speak of old wounds and regrets that haunted quiet nights. I listened, then reminded him that the kingdom heals deeply, not superficially. Christ does not simply mend, he rebuilds. He restores what sin deformed and strengthens what guilt weakened. Hope flickered in his eyes like a lamp newly lit. As we climbed another rise, he paused, gazing at the horizon. Could God truly add all things? He asked. I answered with confidence born from fire and deliverance. The King does not forget his children. His timing is not early nor late, but sovereignly exact. What he adds aligns with eternity, not impulse. I told him that Christ commands us to seek the kingdom, not to restrict life, but to save us from building empires of dust. Everything outside the kingdom collapses. Everything within it endures. He nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle deep as roots. As evening shadows lengthened, he confessed fear of failing the journey. I told him perseverance is not the triumph of willpower, but the fruit of continual yielding. The kingdom is not kept by perfect pilgrims, but by a perfect king. He exhaled as though laying down a weight he had carried alone. At last we reached a high place where the sky bent close to earth. There he stopped. No longer did he ask about cost or consequence. His heart had shifted from seeking blessings to seeking the king himself. And when a man desires the king above all, the kingdom has already begun its reign within him. When we descended toward the path home, I knew his soul had been reordered. He no longer walked as a man torn between two masters. He walked as one claimed by the rightful king. And seeking the kingdom first was no longer a theory to him, but the pulse of a new life being written by God's hand. If this story touched your heart, comment your favorite lesson below. Night settled gently across the hills as I, John Bunyan, watched the young man walk beside me with a peace unfamiliar to his former steps. His eyes no longer darted with worry or dimmed under the weight of unanswered questions. They held a steady glow, the quiet fire of a heart newly governed by the king. He told me he finally understood that seeking the kingdom first was not a burden, but a release. It was the surrender of exhaustion, the loosening of fears he had carried for years. In giving Christ the first place, he found a rest stronger than certainty and a trust deeper than understanding. The government of God had become his refuge. As we made our way back through the dim-lit path, he spoke like one awakening from a long captivity. The demands that once ruled him seemed small now, stripped of their former power. His anxieties could no longer clench his spirit, for the kingdom had reordered his vision. He walked as one aligned with eternity. When we reached the broken stone, he touched it softly, no longer with confusion, but with reverence. He understood that seeking the kingdom was not escaping the world, but living in it under a higher allegiance. That stone marked the moment when his heart bowed to a throne unseen, yet more real than anything he had ever pursued. I parted from him with a joy only heaven can kindle. The kingdom had found its place in him, and he would walk forward not in perfect certainty, but in perfect surrender. Under the reign of Christ, every need would be met in its season, every fear quieted, every step guided. For where the King rules, the soul finally rests. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope.